This is the video lecture for Lesson 21 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. In this video lecture, we will discuss contract verbs, reflexive pronouns, and the Greek word pasapon, which means all or everything. To begin with contract verbs, these are our first special class of verbs that we will be covering in future lectures. These verbs have a stem that ends in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. And so what happens is that when you add the personal ending to these verbs, the vowel at the end contracts or combines with the vowel of those personal endings. This results in slight changes to the endings. Fortunately, this only affects the present tense and the imperfect indicative. In other tenses, the vowel at the end of the stem will lengthen before the infix or personal endings. So here are just a few examples of contract verbs. And what is really important is that you can recognize what you know, which are those personal endings, and then begin to work backwards to understand contraction. And I want to encourage you that the more we see these, the more we will get used to them. So the first one is laleo in the second person plural. Here the stem is lale with that epsilon at the end, and then we add the stem ete for the second person plural, and the result is lalete with the circumflex over the iota. And you can see that there's been a slight change by combining those two epsilons. The second example is from agapao in the third person singular. Again, agapa is our basic stem for the verb. We've dropped the omega. And then if we were adding the third singular ending a, you can see that agapa plus a results in an alpha and an epsilon being combined. And so we have at the end agapa, right? And so we don't. This is one of the stranger ones because it doesn't have any of the indicators of the third singular. But notice that iota subscript under the alpha, and that will remind you that that's the iota of the third singular ending. It's just sort of hiding. And finally, let's look at plerao in the first person plural. Again, by dropping that omega, we see plera is our stem. And then we add omen, which is that first plural ending. And so we have plera omen. And you can see that those two omicrons combine to give us an upsilon in the final form. So plerumen is the form that we would see in the Greek New Testament or in the exercises. Reflexive pronouns are the next topic of this lecture. And these are, again, just a sort of a specific class of pronouns. They are pronouns that refer back to the subject of the sentence or the clause. And so because of that, they will never be the subject if they're referring back to the subject. And so there are no nominative forms. We would translate these as of myself, of yourself, of himself, herself, or itself, or the like, depending on the case that the pronoun occurs in. Fortunately, the forms are very similar to the pronoun autos, but in some cases there is simply a prefix. And so with the first person forms, the prefix for the singulars is m, and e with the plural. Actually, it will be he with a little rough breathing in the plural forms, and that there are no neuter forms in the first person singular. Similarly, with the second person singular, we add the prefix se in the singular or he in the plural. And again, there are no neuter forms. And then finally, the third person forms simply have the addition of that epsilon with the rough breathing, he, in both the singular and the plural. So with those general words in mind, let's look at these charts of the reflexive pronouns. So first of all, in the first person, you can see the singular. I've tried to show you with the various colors how that prefix m has been added to a basic personal pronoun autos that we've gotten used to seeing. So autou is the genitive masculine singular of that pronoun autos. And so we see it here, emautou. emautes, emauto, emaute, emautan, emauten. And so those red endings are the endings that you've become very familiar with the definite article and with the pronoun autos. And we see the pattern is slightly different in the plural. There is no M, it's simply he. But again, the endings are identical. So he auton, he auton, he autois, he autais, he autus, he autas. So again, as with many of these later lessons in the textbook, it's really important for you to begin to recognize aspects that you've already learned and simply apply that knowledge to these new forms. Now the forms of the second person reflexive pronoun. Again, you can see that the se has been added throughout in the singular forms, but the endings, again, are exactly what we're used to with the definite article and the pronoun. So, se autu, se autes, se auto, se aute, se autan, se auten. And then in the plural, just like the plural in the first person, we see the rough breathing, the epsilon with the rough breathing. He auton, he auton, he autois, he autais, he autus, he autas. And you'll notice that those plural forms are identical to the plural forms in the first singular, and so only context will tell us how to translate those differently. Finally, the reflexive pronouns for third person. You'll notice that in the singular, there is the epsilon with the rough breathing throughout, that we now have feminine, masculine, and neuter genders, but that the endings are, again, what we would expect with autos or with the definite article. So, he autu, he autes, he autu, he auto, he aute, he auto, he autan, he auten, he auta. And then in the plural, this will look very familiar to you. Again, he auton, he auton, he auton, he autois, he autais, he autois, he autus, he autas, he auta. Again, very similar to the forms that we've seen with the first and second person plural, but now we have the neuter forms that have been added. Finally, want to discuss briefly the adjective pas, which means all or everything in English. That's how we would translate it. So the endings for this adjective resemble the aorist active participle of luo. So lusas, lusasa, lusan. And before looking at these forms, I just want to give us a sense of their syntax, of how they occur in Greek sentences and how we would translate them. So when they occur in the predicate position, that is, when they do not have their own definite article, we would translate these as all. When they are in the attributive position, when they do have a definite article, we would translate as whole. And when they occur in the substantive, when they occur without modifying a noun or a pronoun, they will be translated as all or every. Without the definite article, we would also translate as every or each. And this word, or the forms of this word, are used with other parts of speech, including pronouns, demonstratives, and participles. So here are the forms of pas. You'll see that it occurs in all three genders and in these four cases. And what I've tried to highlight with this chart is the various endings in red that resemble the forms of the aorist active participle of luo, so that you can sort of apply that previous knowledge to this new chart. And so you'll remember that the aorist active indicative or the aorist active participle resembled third declension nouns in the masculine and the neuter. And so I've added the nt infix as well as marking those endings. And so again, the goal here is that you are applying previous knowledge to these new forms rather than hopefully having to memorize these forms in their entirety. But you can begin to recognize those basic nominative forms, pas, pasa, pan, and then from there you can begin to see clues as to the genitive, dative, and accusative. Here, again, is the plural forms of pas. So pantes, pasai, panta. And these are very similar to what we would see with the plural forms of the aorist active participle, or third declension nouns for masculine and neuter forms of pas, and first declension nouns for the feminine forms of pas. All right, I want to start with the first practice and review exercise from this lesson. And in my translation and in my analysis of this exercise, I'm simply going to review the new information that has been introduced in this lecture. So, agapomen de pantas tu adelphus hemon, kai passas tas adelphos hemon, kai parakalumen zen me heautois, ala to kurio. To begin with, let's look at the contract verbs that are in this sentence. You'll notice the first of these is agapomen. And if we break this out with the agapa stem plus the omen ending, you can see how that alpha and the omicron combine or contract and get the omega with the circumflex over it. This would be the present active indicative first plural from agapao. The next one is parakalumen. And again, I've tried to break it down so you can see parakale is that stem with the epsilon at the end, and then we add amen to the end, or as the personal ending. And so the epsilon and the omicron combine to give us that umen. Again, this is present active indicative, first person plural. And probably the trickiest verb in this exercise is zain, which is from zao. And so when you drop the omega from zao, you're left with an alpha. And then when you combine the alpha with that diphthong ain, the result is the eta with the circumflex and then the nu. And we would translate this, or we would parse this as present active infinitive. So then there are two uses of pas here. The first is pantas tus adelphus. This is an example of it being in the predicate position. It does not have its own definite article, and it doesn't stand in between the definite article and the adjective it modifies. And so we would translate this as all. And so all the brothers. And notice that pantas here agrees in number, gender, and case with tus adelphus, which it modifies. Very similarly, passas tas adelphas is also in the predicate position. Therefore, we would translate it as all the sisters. And once again, it has that agreement in number, gender, and case. And finally, there is one reflexive pronoun, heautois there. So the phrase is zain me heautois. And we would parse this as masculine plural dative. And it's referring to the subject of that infinitive zain, which in this case is brothers and sisters, right? So we are encouraging them, that is the brothers and sisters, not to live for themselves, but for the Lord. So to or for themselves would be that basic translation of heautois. And so with these basic ideas in mind, we would have a translation something like, but we love all our brothers and all our sisters, and we encourage them to live not for themselves, but for the Lord. That is the end of the lecture for Lesson 21. Thank you for your attention.